Section 3. You will hear a university tutor talking to two students about a presentation they have made in a recent botany seminar. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25.
Pause the recording for 30 seconds.
Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 25.
Well, Anita and Lee, that was an interesting presentation you made about John Chapman.
Thanks.
There are a few points I'd like to run through before you write it up. One thing, which you didn't explain, was why you decided to do a presentation on this man who spread apple varieties across the US.
Well, ages ago, we were chatting about stuff we'd read as children, and I told Lee the Johnny Appleseed story. I had these American storybooks when I was small. Then when we were looking into the area of domesticated species of plants for our presentation, we realised that the introduction of the apple with the settlers in the US would be a good case study.
And I remembered Chapman, so we looked up the real guy behind the legend.
Right. I think that would have made a good intro.
I thought it was too personal.
Just a couple of minutes would have drawn your listeners in. Anyway, now a more serious point. You didn't mention the sources of some of your information.
We used some books and journal articles and did an internet search and found some good sites.
We've put them on the back of the handout we gave everyone at the end.
Oh, let me see. Oh, here it is. Johnny Appleseed, Man and Myth, 1967. Well, the thing is, you really have to make this explicit when you talk. And anything you show, data you project from your laptop, etc., you must have the source on it.
Right, OK.
At least you have got it all documented. I was a bit concerned about that.
Sorry.
Anyway, now the content of your talk. What your listeners wanted to understand was whether there were apples in the US before the Europeans started to live there. Well, you told us the early settlers had brought young apple trees, but that few of them had thrived because the climate was harsh. But what about native species? I don't think you were very clear about species already there.
According to what I've read, there were some crab apples, but that was all. Everything that people now think of as traditional American apples was species that the Europeans either introduced or bred by chance.
Because they tended to sow seeds rather than use grafting.
Yes, quite. But what to me was fascinating, and I saw most members of your audience start to take notes, was when you discussed how the apple genes spread via the Silk Route into Europe from the wild apple woods of Kazakhstan.
Yes, well, I'd like to have said more about the development of grafting in ancient China as a way of producing predictable varieties. It was so early in history.
But it's the natural development of the original wild apple into new species that people wanted more about, which says a lot for your presentation. You enthused your audience. So now we need to discuss the form your follow-up work will take. Are you going to produce a paper? Or are you thinking of putting it all up on the department website?
I felt we could do both, and we could do a poster of some of the data. But Lee wasn't sure.
No, I think it would be enough to use the website. We can offer a link to our email for queries. That would save time and trees.
I think Lee's right. A poster would be nice, but it'd take too much time.
OK.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30.
Pause the recording for 30 seconds.
Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30.
Now, I just want to give you a few pointers about the techniques of your presentation. Mostly, it was good. But there are a few things you need to bear in mind next time you do one. You both managed the hardware, I mean the projector and things, very well indeed, which is always a great help.
Good.
Oh, thanks.
You'd obviously checked it out carefully.
Yes. But unfortunately, we hadn't finished our maps when we did the practice on my computer at home. That's why there was some the wrong way up.
We didn't realise the software on the laptop was a bit different from the one I have.
But you sorted out the problem very quickly and didn't let it fluster you, so it wasn't a big problem. We could all read the map when we needed to.
So it was okay, but we could have done better, we realise.
There was a bit at the end where I felt something didn't go as you'd planned. Am I right?
We had a few maps which we ended up leaving out because we needed to get on to our conclusions.
Yes, it took longer to explain the technical aspects of grafting than we'd expected.
So, sticking to the time limit for each part of our presentation is something we didn't manage at all. Which means we've definitely got to improve before we do another one.
Yes.
Apart from that, well, the handout was perfectly adequate for a seminar like this. It gave all the key information, and, of course, now I realise the sources are listed at the back. But you need to do those references in the correct format, as footnotes, in future.
OK.
Yes, sorry, we will.
And finally, other students will be presenting projects later in the course. I shall be reminding them how well you both spoke, and that no one had any problem hearing or understanding either of you. In that respect, your talk was a model that the others can follow.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, thanks very much. This feedback has been very helpful.
Well done, both of you. See you in a fortnight.
Bye.
Yes, thanks.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Pause the recording for 30 seconds.
Now turn to section 4.
Recording 61. You will hear two students discussing their assignments. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26.
Hi, Mike. How's it going?
Actually, I was up last night with an assignment, so yeah, I'm tired, but I guess we'd better sort this presentation out.
Well, we've done enough background reading, but I think we need to organise exactly what we're going to say about biofuels during the presentation, and the order.
I thought we could start by asking our audience what car engines were first designed to run on, fossil fuels or biofuels.
Nice idea.
Yes, when most people think about cars and fuel, they think about all the carbon dioxide that's produced, but they don't realise that that wasn't always the case.
You're probably right. The earliest car engines ran on fuel made from corn and peanut oil, didn't they?
Yes. The manufacturers used the corn and peanut oil and turned them into a kind of very pure alcohol.
You mean ethanol?
Yes. In fact, most biofuels are still based on ethanol. Actually, I've got some notes here about the process of turning plant matter into ethanol, the chemical reactions and the fermentation stages, and...
It's interesting. The other students would appreciate it, but different biofuels use different processes, and if we give a general description, there's a risk we'll get it wrong, and then the tutor might mark us down. I'd rather we focus on the environmental issues.
Fair enough. So, the main plants that are used for biofuel production now are sugarcane, corn,
And canola. Of all of them, canola is probably the least harmful because machines that use it don't produce as much carbon monoxide.
Sugarcane seems to be controversial. It doesn't require as much fertiliser as corn does to grow, but when they burn the sugarcane fields, that releases loads of greenhouse gases.
Yes, but some critics have suggested that the production of corn ethanol uses up more fossil fuel energy than the biofuel energy it eventually produces. For that reason, I'd say it was more harmful to the environment.
I see what you mean. You're probably right. It's interesting how everyone saw the biofuel industry as the answer to our energy problems, but in some ways, biofuels have created new problems.
Well, in the USA, I wouldn't say that farmers are having problems. The biofuel industry for them has turned out to be really profitable.
I think, though, that even in the USA, ethanol is still only used as an additive to gasoline or petrol. The problem is that it still has to be transported by trucks or rail because they haven't built any pipelines to move it. Once they do, it'll be cheaper and the industry might move forward.
That'll have to happen one day. At least the government are in favour of biofuel development.
Yes, but Brazil's probably in the lead as far as biofuels are concerned. They've got to the point where they don't need to import any oil now.
Which is great. And the industry in Brazil employs a huge number of people. But is it sustainable? I mean, as the population grows and there are more vehicles on the roads and there's more machinery, surely they can't depend so much on sugarcane. At some point, there has to be a limit on how much land can be used for sugarcane production. Certainly if you want to preserve natural habitats and native wildlife.
I think that whatever problems Brazil's facing now, the same will be true for any country. You have to weigh up the pros and cons.
Well, we probably won't see an increase in biofuel use. I mean, they won't replace fossil fuels until we can find ways to produce them cheaply and quickly and with less cost to the environment.
Making sure they require minimal energy to produce.
Exactly. And in a way, that means they have to cost less than fossil fuels, certainly when you're filling up your car.
Yes, and whatever other kind of engines use fossil fuels at the moment.
Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
All right, so in the last section of the presentation, what problems are we focusing on?
Well, we've already had a look at different types of pollution in the first section, so we can leave that out. But the biggest issue related to biofuels is that land is now being used to grow biofuel crops, and that's contributing to global hunger.
Indeed. It doesn't seem right we're using corn to run cars when people can't afford to buy it to eat. Yes, let's talk about that. The other thing is that in some countries, the way that biofuel crops are grown and harvested still produces a great deal of pollution, really damaging to the atmosphere.
OK, that's definitely an issue we should look at.
Let's not finish on a negative note, though. Why don't we talk about the potential new sources of biofuel? So rather than corn and sugarcane, what other plants could be used?
Good. Some companies are exploring the possibility of using wood and seeing how that can be used to make ethanol.
Yes, and algae is another possibility. You can grow it in any water and it absorbs pollutants too.
I read that. And grasses, they're another plant that researchers are investigating as a biofuel.
And these kind of plants aren't used as food, which is why...
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 4.
Test 2. Exam practice. Listening, section 3. You will hear two people called Chloe and Ivan talking about a business studies course. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25.
Pause the recording for 30 seconds.
Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 25.
Oh, hi, Ivan.
Oh, hi, Chloe.
I'm glad I bumped into you because I've been looking at this prospectus about courses at the university. I'm thinking of doing a business studies degree. Isn't that what you're doing?
Yes, I'm about to start my 3rd year. I think you'd enjoy it. Is there something on the course that you're not sure about?
Well, you know I've been working for a publisher for the last 4 years as a production assistant.
That will be really valuable experience because a lot of people go to university straight from school and don't have that kind of background.
Yeah, I know. And I'm used to dealing with figures and percentages and things, but it's been a while since I've sat down and put my ideas into an essay. I was never that good at it, and I'm not sure I can do it now.
But you did okay at school, so I'm sure you'll soon get into it again. I was worried about different things when I started, like if I'd be able to use all the computer programs. But you only really need the basics. You have to do a lot of presentations, and I thought that would be hard. But we'd actually had such a lot of practice at school, it was fine.
But did you find writing essays easy?
Oh, it was okay, but I was hopeless at getting them in by the deadline. And I was always late for lectures, so I had to work hard at that, and I tend to be early now.
It's good that you've sorted yourself out before you go and get a job, or you might not have it very long. I think the course looks really interesting.
It is. And it also gave me the chance to spend 6 months working in a local business last year.
That's not so important for me, unless I could go abroad to use my foreign languages. But that doesn't seem to be on offer, which is a shame. What really appeals to me, though, is the idea of being assessed throughout the year. I think that's a much more productive way of learning, instead of everything being decided in an exam at the end.
It's good for people like you who are hard-working all year round. You'll be spending all your time in the library. They've just expanded it too.
That's good.
Well, yes and no. They've made the study area bigger, but it means they've taken some of the magazines and periodicals away. So I think it was better as it was. The university is expanding all the time, and there are lots of new courses coming next year.
Well, that's great news, isn't it? It means the college will have a better reputation, as more people will hear about it. So that's good for us.
I agree, but they really need to add more lecture rooms, as we often have lectures in tiny rooms.
Well, you obviously think overall it's a good place to do a degree. I should probably go and have a look round.
Well, it's holidays now, and there's not much going on there.
Oh. So it's probably not worth going in now.
But you could email my tutor. I know he'd be happy to answer any questions. I can give you his email address. I looked at quite a lot of other universities and read loads of prospectuses, but I thought this one was the best.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30.
Pause the recording for 30 seconds.
Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30.
I was a bit unsure about all the different subjects you can choose on this course.
Well, I can tell you a bit about them. There are some subjects you have to do and some that you can choose. The most interesting course I've done is public relations.
From what I've read, it doesn't look very demanding. Some of it is really just common sense.
But it will be really useful if you want to go into marketing or advertising.
That's true. But I need to find out a bit more about it first before I decide if it will really help me. It's difficult to tell from the prospectus.
But you are interested in marketing?
Oh, yes.
Well, you can choose a marketing course. I wasn't very impressed with that course, actually. The tutor didn't make it very interesting.
It's good to put on your CV that you've done a marketing course, though. So that would be a definite for me, and maybe I'd get a different tutor. What other courses did you choose?
I'm doing taxation as I was thinking of training to be an accountant, but I'm not sure now.
Oh, that will be a good option for me, because I enjoy working with figures. Although I don't want to be an accountant, it'll be good to have an understanding of taxation, especially if I ever run my own business.
Then there's the most popular course, which is human resources, and a lot of people seem to get jobs in that field.
My friend works in human resources, and she's really good at it. But I don't think I've got the right personality, so I'd give that one a miss. I'm more interested in how businesses actually work, the structure.
That's a compulsory course, the structure of business.
Oh.
But you might find information systems helpful.
Is that kind of computer programs?
Some of it is, but also databases, project management, and other things.
Oh, this sounds useful. But I'll have to look at some of the other possibilities first. You know, Ivan, this course sounds as though it would suit me. I'm going to apply.
Great. If there's anything else you want to ask me, you've got my number.
Thanks.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Pause the recording for 30 seconds.
Section 3. You will hear a conversation between Cressida, a student of journalism, and her tutor, Dr. Erskine, about a work placement that she has recently done. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26.
Pause the recording for 30 seconds.
Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 26.
Well, Cressida, that was an interesting presentation you gave yesterday on your placement at the TV News Centre.
Thank you, Dr. Erskine. I did work hard on it.
Yes, and you did entertain the class. They enjoyed your humour, but you informed them too. But I felt there was a bit of a backstory. You know, something you weren't telling us. So how was it really?
Yeah, well, I learned a lot, as I said. But I think some of the lessons weren't ones I wanted to share with the whole group. I mean, my expectations about what it would be like were too high. I'd been fantasising a bit about what I'd be doing. I mean, it all worked out okay in the end. But I got off to a bad start.
Yes, I heard something similar from the producer, Ainsley Webb, who assessed your performance. He was quite negative about some of the things you did and your initial attitude, I'm afraid. Would you like to give me your version?
I didn't prepare properly is the main thing. On my first morning, I hadn't checked my commuting route properly, and I didn't notice that it says the buses don't start till 6. I had to run all the way to the studio, but I was still late, and I looked a mess.
Well, better at this stage of your career than later. To be honest, I made the same kind of mistakes when I was your age. But anyway, as I say, I think the presentation yesterday went extremely well, and I will bear that in mind when I grade your work experience overall.
Thank you for being so understanding.
Right. Now, have you completed your diary of what you did there? Professor Jenkins hasn't received it, he said.
Yes, I have finished it, but I wanted to just tidy it up a bit. Some of it was written in a bit of a hurry. I'll email it to him this afternoon.
OK, but I'm afraid he says this will have to be the last time you submit late. Journalism is all about deadlines, and if you can't manage them on your course, he can't give you a diploma saying you're competent, can he?
Oh, yes, I'll do it straight after this. I didn't realise.
Well, he can be a bit abrupt if he's kept waiting. It's the one thing he really doesn't like.
Ooh.
I'm sure everything is going to be fine. You're getting very good grades on your work, so as long as you remember that.
Yes.
Now, did you manage OK generally, do you think?
Yeah, OK, I think. Well, it took a while to get to grips with all the equipment. Some of it was quite old. Not as fast as what we have here in college, and at first I kept thinking it was my fault. I wasn't pressing the right buttons or something. The thing was, none of the TV centre staff asked me if I wanted instructions. If I asked them how to do some particular operation, they were perfectly civil and would show me, and even say thank you for what I did do. But I felt awkward to keep asking.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 27 to 30.
Pause the recording for 30 seconds.
Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
Now, well, let's just review where you are, your write-up, and what you're going to include going forward to next term. First of all, did you eventually feel you were given enough to do?
The first couple of days were manic. The production team was short of staff, and I was rushing all over the building, taking messages to various people and fetching things. Of course, I didn't know my way around, so I kept ending up in some storeroom or somewhere instead of the studio I was meant to be in. Or I mistook some important visitor for a colleague because I didn't know who anyone was. Then, after that, things sort of calmed down. So sometimes I was hanging about until someone decided to give me a chore. But I had a piece of luck at the end of the week, because they got a new bit of equipment which was the same as we have in the editing suite here, and I knew how to use it, which none of them did. So that gave me a bit of status. Unfortunately, it meant I spent the next 3 days stuck in the editing suite. But by the end, I'd shown I wasn't just a silly student. So then, when the senior reporter needed someone to go out with him when he went to interview a junior minister, I got to go along, because he knew I could handle the technical side.
Well, that's good.
Yes. Well, I know I need to learn from my mistakes. I mean, basically, I need to think more about forward planning. But on the other hand, I feel much more confident now. I did survive. I didn't ruin anything. I did actually make a contribution, according to the producer. One thing I want to take forward to my final assignment, though, is some reflections on ethics.
Yes?
I had a bit of an argument with one of the senior presenters. He was editing part of an interview, and he just changed something someone said. When I questioned him, he just snubbed me. And I mean, this wasn't some public relations expert or government professional spokesperson. It was like a member of the public. But he said, oh, they never remember what they said anyway.
You want to develop this into part of your final assignment? It would be a very positive line. I can give you some references.
Oh, thanks. That would be great.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Pause the recording for 30 seconds.
Now turn to section 4. Test 1. Exam practice. Listening, section 4. You will hear part of a lecture about exotic pests given as the introduction to a course on ecology and environment. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40.
Pause the recording for 1 minute.
Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Good afternoon. I want this afternoon, as an introduction to our ecology module, to offer examples of exotic pests, non-native animals or plants which are, or may be, causing problems, which might prove a fruitful topic for seminar papers later in the term. People and products are crisscrossing the world as never before. And on these new global highways, plants and animals are travelling too. Exotic plants and animals are turning up in Antarctica and on the most remote islands on Earth. For example, the Australian red-backed spider. It's made its way to countries fairly near home, such as New Zealand and Japan, as some of you may know. Well, it's also been found on Tristan da Cunha, which is a remote island thousands of miles from anywhere, way out in the middle of the Atlantic. Now, another famous animal invader in the other direction, so to speak, from England to Australia in the southern hemisphere, is the rabbit. This was in 1830, and it might seem less of a threat, but it became an extraordinarily destructive pest. The fact that rabbits increased so rapidly is perhaps more understandable when we remind ourselves that they had originally been introduced to England from continental Europe 8 centuries earlier. This was because they were regarded as a luxury food source, and in spite of having warm fur, they probably originated on the hot, dry plains of Spain, which of course explains why they thrive in the climate of Australia. A much less cuddly example of a pest introduced to Australia, this time from America, is fire ants. These are increasing and spreading very fast. Their huge nests can now be found in gardens in the city of Brisbane, and they are costing the Australian government a great deal of money in control measures. These were an accidental introduction, rather than a deliberate one, brought to Australia, probably in horticultural imports or in mud on second-hand machinery. As a biologist and conservationist, I have become increasingly concerned about these matters. Exotic invasions are irreversible and deserve to be taken more seriously, even when they aren't particularly damaging. For example, something that is not necessarily a major disaster compared to other ecological experiments. In 1975, an Australian species of earthworm was deliberately introduced to the Northern Hemisphere, in Scotland, because they were bigger than the natives. The aim was that they would be more effective than native species, but in fact, they don't do more for the soil condition than the smaller locals, which they displace. Although they don't do a lot of harm, as far as we know up to now, this will probably prove to have been a mistake. A much more serious case, also in Scotland, as well as other countries, along with the latest victim, Iceland, is the New Zealand flatworm. This is a most unwelcome newcomer in these regions of northwest Europe. Basically, this flatworm came into these countries by accident. It's now been realised that it was actually carried in the plant pots containing exotic ornamental shrubs and so on, and as it eats local earthworms and doesn't benefit the local ecology in any way, it is a real pest. Next, there's a further instance, this time in the water, and it's come from Japan. It's a delicious but very fast-spreading seaweed, and is one of many exotic species, large and small, in the seas covering the rocks around Australia. Unfortunately, it is replacing indigenous seaweeds and permanently altering the ecosystem. However, to look at the situation from a business point of view, it is now being harvested and exported, dried, back to Japan, its original home, where it's particularly popular. So, sometimes we may find accidental benefits from apparently harmful arrivals. Well, you could say that world ecology is now going the same way as popular culture. Global music and fashions, food and drinks are taking over from local ones in every land. And in ecosystems, we find vigorous exotic invaders overwhelming native species and natural habitats. But can we find any examples of invaders which appear to be a problem and then find that in fact they may not be such a big issue after all? We might take as an example a native of Australia, the budgerigar, the most common pet parrot in the world, of course. Because there have been many escapes over the years, it is now to be found flying about in feral flocks where the climate suits it. So, these flocks of budgerigars have been getting very numerous in the southeast of the United States, particularly in residential areas. People have been getting quite worried about this, but it has been observed that the size of the flocks has diminished somewhat recently. The fact that they are smaller is thought to be due to the fact that new competitors for their habitat have arrived from other places. That's the last example for now. What I'd like you to consider is this. Is the planet Earth moving towards a one-world ecosystem? How far would it be a wholly bad development?
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Pause the recording for 30 seconds.
Section 3. You will hear two psychology students called Tim and Laura talking about Laura's work placement. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 24.
Hi, Laura. Could you spare a few minutes to talk about the work placement you did last summer? I'm thinking of doing one myself.
Hi, Tim. Sure.
Didn't you do yours at an environmental services company?
That's right. It's only a very small company, and they needed someone to produce a company brochure. And I wanted to get some business experience because I'm interested in a career in occupational psychology in a business environment. It was good because I had overall responsibility for the project.
What kind of skills do you think you developed on the placement? I mean, apart from the ones you already had. Did you have to do all the artwork for the brochure, the layout and everything?
We hired the services of a professional photographer for that. I did have to use my IT skills to a certain extent because I cut and pasted text from marketing leaflets. But that didn't involve anything I hadn't done before.
Do you think you got any better at managing your time and prioritizing things? You always used to say you had trouble with that.
Oh, definitely. There was so much pressure to meet the project deadline.
And I also got better at explaining things and asserting my opinions, because I had to have weekly consultations with the marketing manager and give him a progress report.
It sounds as if you got a lot out of it then.
Absolutely. It was really worthwhile. But, the company benefited too.
Yes, they must have done. After all, if they'd used a professional advertising agency to produce their brochure instead of doing it in-house, presumably they'd have paid a lot more.
Oh, yes. I worked it out. It would have been 250% more, and I thought the end result was good, even though we did everything on site. The company has quite a powerful computer, and I managed to borrow some scanning software from the university. The new brochure looks really professional. It enhances the image of the company straight away.
So, in the long run, it should help them to attract clients and improve their sales figures?
That's the idea, yeah.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
Well, all in all, it sounds very positive. I think I'll go ahead and apply for a placement myself. How do I go about it?
It's easy enough to do, because there's a government agency called STEP, S-T-E-P, that organizes placements for students. You should start by getting their booklet with all the details. I expect you can download one from their website.
Actually, they've got copies in the psychology department. I've seen them there. I'll just go to the office and pick one up.
Right. And then, if I were you, after I'd looked at it, I'd go over all the options with someone.
I suppose I should ask my tutor's advice. He knows more about me than anyone.
One of the career officers would be better. They've got more knowledge about the jobs market than your personal tutor would have.
Okay.
And then, when you know what you want, you can register with STEP. You'll find their address in the booklet. And once you've registered, they assign you to a mentor who looks after your application.
And then I suppose you just sit back and wait till you hear something?
They told me at the careers office that it's best to be proactive and get updates yourself by checking the website for new placement alerts. Your mentor is supposed to keep you informed, but you can't rely on that.
I don't suppose it's a good idea to get in touch with companies directly, is it?
Not really. But it is the company who notifies you if they want you to go for an interview. You get a letter of invitation or an email from personnel department.
And do I reply directly to them?
Yes, you do. STEP only gets involved again once you've been made a job offer.
Right. So once you've had an interview, you should let your mentor know what the outcome is? I mean, whether you're offered a job and whether you've decided to accept it?
That's right. They'll inform the careers office once a placement has been agreed, so you don't have to do that.
Is that all then?
More or less. Only once you've accepted an offer, you'll probably have to supply a reference, because the placement will be conditional on that. And that's something you should ask your own tutor to provide. He knows about your academic ability and also about your qualities, like reliability.
Well, thanks very much for the information. I'm starting to look forward to...
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 4.
Test 2. Exam practice. Listening, section 4. You will hear a talk by a meteorologist about weather forecasting. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40.
Pause the recording for 1 minute.
Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
I work for the National Weather Service, and as part of your course on weather patterns, I've been asked to talk to you about how we predict the weather. We're so used to switching on our TVs and getting an up-to-date weather forecast at any time of day or night that we probably forget that this level of sophistication has only been achieved in the last few decades, and weather forecasting is actually an ancient art. So I want to start by looking back into history. The earliest weather forecasts appeared in the 1500s in almanacs, which were lists of information produced every year. Their predictions relied heavily on making links between the weather and where the planets were in the sky on certain days. In addition, predictions were often based on information, like if the fourth night after a new moon was clear, good weather was expected to follow. But once basic weather instruments were invented, things slowly started to change. In the mid-15th century, a man called Nicholas Cusa, a German mathematician, designed a hygrometer which told people how much humidity there was in the air. To do this, Cusa put some sheep's wool on a set of scales and then monitored the change in the wool's weight according to the air conditions. A piece of equipment we all know and use is the thermometer. Changes in temperature couldn't really be measured until the Italian Galileo Galilei invented his thermometer in 1593. It wasn't like a modern-day thermometer because it had water inside it instead of mercury. In fact, it wasn't until 1714 that Gabriel Fahrenheit invented the first mercury thermometer. In 1643, another Italian, called Evangelista Torricelli, invented the first barometer, which measured atmospheric pressure. This was another big step forward in more accurate weather predicting. As time went on, during the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, all these meteorological instruments were improved and developed, and people in different countries began to record measurements relating to their local weather. However, in those days it was very difficult to send records from one part of the world to another, so it wasn't possible for them to share their information until the electric telegraph became more widespread. This meant that weather observations could be sent on a regular basis to and from different countries. By the 1860s, therefore, weather forecasts were becoming more common and accurate because they were based on observations taken at the same time over a wide area. In 1863, France started publishing weather maps each day. This hadn't been done before, and other nations soon followed. So that was the start of national weather forecasting. And I'll now tell you how we at the National Weather Centre get the information we need to produce a forecast. Even today, one of the most important methods we use is observations, which tell us what the weather is doing right now. Observation reports are sent automatically from equipment at a number of weather stations in different parts of the country. They are nearly all based at airports, although a few are in urban centres. The equipment senses temperature, humidity, pressure, and wind speed direction. Meteorologists also rely really heavily on satellites, which send images to our computer screens. What we see on our screens is bright colours. Orange represents dry air, and bright blue shows moisture levels in the atmosphere. The satellites are located 22,000 miles above the surface of the Earth, and it's amazing that despite that distance, it's possible for us to make out an individual cloud and follow it as it moves across the landscape. In addition to collecting data from the ground, we need to know what's happening in the upper levels of the atmosphere. So a couple of times a day, from many sites across the country, we send radio sondes into the air. A radio sonde is a box containing a package of equipment, and it hangs from a balloon which is filled with gas. Data is transmitted back to the weather station. Finally, radar. This was first used over 150 years ago and still is. New advances are being made all the time, and it is one method for detecting and monitoring the progress of hurricanes. Crucial information is shown by different colours representing speed and direction. Radar is also used by aircraft, of course. All this information from different sources is put into computer models, which are like massive computer programs. Sometimes they all give us the same story, and sometimes we have to use our own experience to decide which is showing the most accurate forecast, which we then pass on to you. So, I hope next time you watch the weather forecast, you'll think about how we meteorologists spend our time. And maybe I've persuaded some of you to study meteorology in more depth.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Pause the recording for 30 seconds.